Shalom and welcome to another edition of Parasha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malamed in Highland Park, New Jersey at the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation on Shamet. Joining me from a non-disclosed location, Rabbi Jeremy Komolowski, Anshe Chesed, and Rabbi Barry John Chesler in Long Island. It's great to see you. We have an amazing Parsha. Let's get right into it. Shalch Lecha Anashim. Here, let me set it up for you. God says to Moses, Shlach lecha anashim, send you men, it's men. What are the men supposed to do, Barry Chesler?
Well, if we want to make an English pun, they're going to take a tour of the land of Israel.
Nice.
Okay, they're going to go to the land of Israel. Moses gives them a series of questions, how good the land is, what kind of produce it has, what kind of people live there, whether the cities are fortified or not. They are kind of feeling their way. They know that this is the land they're supposed to conquer, so they're getting their feet wet. As it were, you send the best. You know, the 12 princes are the best of the best, the leaders of the 12 tribes, and they're supposed to be mechazek. They're supposed to go in, see the land, and come back and say, we need to move on. Let's go.
There is a specific set of instructions. Uritem et haaretz mahi, go and see what the land is. I love there's a beautiful comment that the land raises its people. We've said that before. Little piece of data here in the calendar. V'hayamim yemei bikurei anavim. I wonder if the season that they were sent was the season of the harvesting of grapes, which would be when? The harvesting of grapes is
Shavuot.
About Shavuot. Okay, so they're.
When I was on kibbutz, that's when we were beginning to harvest the grapes.
Okay, so that's not an insignificant detail. That's a significant detail. It says things are ripening, things are happening. It is I guess the Torah's literary way of shaping the kind of anticipatory moment that this is going to be something that we're going to reap. There's going to be something wonderful here. Vayamim yemei bikurei anavim. And then what happens? Rabbi Jeremy Komolowski.
The spies come back. There were 12 of them. They were princes of each tribe. They were exceptionally noble. They were exceptionally talented, and they went. The 12 of them went for this 3-hour tour. No, not a 3-hour tour.
40-day tour.
40-day tour. La Tour Ta'aretz. Barry referenced the pun without it. Always says La Tour. That's they will tour through the land, and they come and they say, man, this is beyond us. Lo nuchala. We're not up to this task. And the people there are gigantic. Yes, it's a wonderful land. There's lots of trees. There's lots of produce. It's awesome. And everybody there is a giant, and they're going to clobber us. And we are just not up to this task. And two of the spies, Kalev and Yehoshua, stand up and say, Yachol nuchala. Oh, yes, we can. We've been through a lot on the way to here, and we can do this too. And whereas the rest of the people are moaning and groaning, Vayahas Kalev, Caleb silences them and tries to give them, unsuccessfully, unfortunately, tries to give them the hope and optimism that this is within their grasp, not beyond it.
So in previous episodes, we've talked about the way that the Torah contributes language to modern Hebrew. And one phrase stands out in particular, Eretz ochelet yoshvea hi. This is a land that eats you up. And you will find Israelis today referring to the land as Eretz ochelet yoshvea. It's a difficult place. It's a beautiful place. It's an amazing place, but it's hard. And this is, I think a particularly modern conundrum of Israel. We love it. We love Israel. We love being in Israel. It's joyful and glorious to be there. It's also challenging, as we, of course, have witnessed over the last few weeks.
But we should point out that this is a case of projection, because they don't see the land devour its inhabitants. The inhabitants are doing quite well. The Israelites think that they're going to be devoured.
Indeed. Okay, so let's go.
There's a funny midrash about this that they arrived at a time when all of the inhabitants were burying their dead, and they thought, oh my goodness, this land is causing these giants to have all these losses. How much for us more? But we have to talk about their self-perception.
Indeed.
Because these people, it's a paradox that you said, Elliot, because the land obviously is nurturing these people because that's how they're growing so big. They're big and strong and mighty. And the spies say, we appeared to ourselves as mere grasshoppers, and so we must have appeared to them as well. So if you feel yourself totally overwhelmed, doused, crushed by the people who are much bigger than you, if everybody looks like Shaquille O'Neal and you are, a little pipsqueak,
and you're a munchkin,
you are going to feel just hopelessness.
Right.
And I think that the rich part of this story is that Moshe and his two closer advisors, Joshua and Caleb, should be giving the people this feeling of possibility, of affirmation, but they're overwhelmed by fear. Fear gets the better of them, and they feel they cannot.
So let's talk about that. And we've made ideas that are really psychological ideas here, the idea of projection, the idea of self-perception. And I think the theme that we'd like to focus on is that this is a deeply psychological story, in the sense that there is a psychology between the leader and the people. There is a psychology between Moses and God. There is projection all around. Let's delve into the psychology this moment. It's a deeply painful moment. Let me quote you. The people react to Moses and Aaron. They complain, "Vayilonu," and that's not new, obviously. "Lu matnu." Would that we have died, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, O Bamidbar, or in the desert, Lu matnu. And isn't it interesting that they are using this kind of such catastrophic language? Moses himself uses that language. Moses says in last week's Parsha, just kill me now, take me out of here. I'm done. And the people are in a way mirroring Moses in the worst way. That's one dynamic going on here. Barry, talk some more about the psychology.
Debilitating for the people is that if they want to have died in Egypt, it means they have no past. If they would have died in the wilderness, they have no present. And they don't see themselves as having a future in the land. So they have nothing. And it's a terrible burden for them. And I think we have to feel some empathy, because let's face it, we like to talk about Joshua and Caleb, but had we been in the generation of the wilderness, 90% likely or more, we would have been with the 10 tribes, not with Joshua and Caleb.
I think that observation is really wonderful about the two dimensions of, if we had died in Egypt, if we died in the desert, the one thing guaranteed to make God enraged in the book of Bamidbar, or other books too, but especially Bamidbar, when you say, I wish we never left Egypt. Like the drive is to move on. And when people say, I wish we had died in Egypt, I wish we never left Egypt, that's like the repudiation of the idea that the people are headed for some kind of spiritual and social and religious achievement. And so they want to give up on the past, they want to give up on the present, and they have no future. That's a great observation. We were talking about, you said before, Elliot, that the populace mirrors Moshe. I think that's really interesting. We closed off last parasha in Bahalotcha with the encounter between Miriam and Aaron, and they're complaining against Moshe. And the reason the Torah gives for Moshe's real greatness is his humility, his anava. But here, just one chapter later, we learn that sometimes anava can hold you back, right? Moses is so humble. Isn't that wonderful? Well, the 10 spies have an extraordinarily overactive view of their own smallness. So humility, on steroids can imprison you.
So I want to just hone in on one thing you said, and maybe connected, which is that there's aggression here. The people have aggression against God by saying what they say, which is the ultimate. It's like the stinger, right? we could have stayed in Egypt. Why did we have to come out? That goes really to the core. That's the moment of aggression. And do you think that the humility brings on this aggression, or do you think that people are exercising or expressing their aggression because of something else? Do they have a problem here with
Well,
God?
they've been brutalized, and sometimes we're a little too glib about their experience of slavery. It's demeaning and it's degrading, and it does not leave people with a lot of dignity. And it's something that we do well to remember. They have been very beaten down people. And, what finally became clear to me, Jeremy, when you were talking, is that when they say they would have rather died in Egypt, that's actually a denial of God, right? God's great gift is the Exodus. He took us out of Egypt, which is going to be echoed when we get to Parashat Tzitzit at the end of the Torah reading. And if we would have rather died in Egypt, it means we didn't need the Exodus. We don't need God. We're better off slaves in Egypt. And that has to be a slap in the face, as it were, of God.
Well, it's in fact, how would you interpret the words ad anna yena'atsuni ha'amazeh? How long will this people yena'atsuni? What does that mean? How long is this people going to smack me in the face? How long is this people going to offend me? How long is people going to really, fill in the blank? What does that mean?
I mean, I think it's provoke, taunt, irk. Smack in the face is pretty good. By the way, niatznu in our ein ze mevarech ela minna eitz. When the Talmud says that somebody who violates, who steals or violates ethical commandments on the way to food, and then goes and makes a bracha on the food, that's not a bracha. Or I mean, it's treif. That's not I actually do think, halakhically speaking, you should make a bracha if you eat treif, but that's not the way Maimonides says it. But the Talmud says, "Ein ze mevarech ela mina eitz." You're not actually blessing. You're actually taunting.
It's repudiation. Okay, so that's the next line. We can relate. How long are they not going to believe in me? How long are they not going to have faith in me? In other words, how long are they going to abandon me, repudiate me, stick me in the eye, smack my face? Enough. Their aggression. And so how would you characterize God's reaction here? It's not exactly the understanding here.
No.
It's kind of petulant.
Yeah.
I think sometimes God expects more of the people than they can deliver. And one of the things we do well to keep in mind is, as it's codified in the halakha, you can't ask people to do what they can't do. It isn't right, and it isn't fair, and sometimes that's part of the situation. But the point I think we have to address is that I think that when we delve into the Parsha, we see a historical moment that the people miss.
Yeah.
And they have a chance that we have to think would have worked to get into the promised land. And two things happen, one in the Torah and one outside the Torah. In the Torah, they're set back a generation because they forfeit not just the moment, but their experience of the land. They will never get to the land. But look at what the rabbis do. They make this the symbol of everything else that's going to happen to the Jews in a negative way, where we also lose historical moments all throughout our history. It's this, as the rabbis say, Maseh Avot Siman Labanim, what happens to our ancestors signifies what will happen to us in some way.
So the question I have, even as we think about this on this level, is how do you know that you're living in a historical moment? I mean, and maybe our present frame of the whole pandemic, today we're recording this on Wednesday, there's, I think certainly a momentous moment. There was an election of a new president. That's obviously a pivotal moment in the leadership, albeit symbolic leadership of Israel. But at barely 10 minutes to midnight before the deadline, they came up with a coalition agreement. It's hobbling and very fragile, but that might be a historical moment. How do you know that you're living in a historical moment? And is it presumptuous if you are? Is it obvious, or is it something you have to reflect on?
You know, that's a great and mysterious question, and perhaps not only is it a really hard question to answer, maybe it's an impossible question to answer, because there's so many different factors that go into making something a historical moment that it's only in retrospect that it turns out to have been one. Like, let's say, you mentioned about the coalition. I think it's totally plausible that the coalition lasts 5 minutes.
Yes.
Okay. And in which case, what looks like a historical moment turns out not to be one.
Well, that goes back to Barry's point, which is that it's a missed opportunity, and that's what you're saying here. Here's the colossal missed opportunity for they could have gone into the land on year 2, whatever. Yeah, continue.
But I would say that one of the things that I like about this story, and I think it is also plausible. We make some omelets out of this cracked egg when we say, that the Dor Hamidbar, the generation of the desert, who had they had to die out before coming into Eretz Yisrael, because they were so, for all the reasons that Barry Chesler said, they were so beaten down and traumatized and brutalized by being slaves. We needed another generation. And there's an aspect of the story that I like, that is exactly the religious meaning of exactly what Barry pointed out, which is that God is always asking us to do things, asking the people in the Torah, and by extension us, to do things that we're not up to, because the divine demands are infinite or nearly infinite. The divine demands, by virtue of being divine, are by definition beyond human ken. And so humans, as they try to be partners in the brit with God, as they try to be servants of God, are always going to be running up against their limitations. And so one of the things that I find powerful about Judaism is that it is a story of exile and return, failure and a second try, a destroyed temple and a rebuilt temple, and a sin and a tshuva. So one of the Mishnah, noting all the bad stuff that happened on Tisha B'Av, says that it is on Tisha B'Av that they came back, the spies came back with a bad report, and God says you're 40 years in the desert. So this becomes, which by the way instantiates that they left around Shavuot, right? Because they left in the sort of high spring, and they come back in high summer with the bad report. But this fits then the mythic pattern of total, divine plan and order, and human failure to actualize it, for which we are always trying to enact a second chance. And I like that. I think this is a religion of the recognition of limited human greatness, and the striving always to be the most that we can be, always falling short, but always trying again.
So
Go ahead.
If we would give it a literary turn. So what you're saying, I think, Jeremy, is that religion, and Judaism in particular, is supposed to be aspirational and inspirational. But if we focus on the perspirational, that's when we come to failure. That we have to get beyond our sweat, the work that we need to do to realize the aspiration and to be lifted by the inspiration. And if we can't do that, then we are mired in our sweat, and it does not come to a good end.
All right, let's go back to another point, which is the psychology. So if Barry, as you're saying, God is a bit petulant here, do you think Moses's direction, Moses's question to God, which is, what are they going to say about you, basically? God wants to destroy the people because of this. Again, he wants to destroy the people, and Moses basically appeals to God's vanity and says, look, what are they going to say about you? The people that you took them out here to die, basically. And then I think this is, again, a great moment. Moses says, Slachna, right? Forgive this people, this great sin, according to your great kindness. And so where is the forgiveness coming from? And what is happening here? What's going on here? And in the back of our minds, I want to compare this to the golden calf episode. How do you relate to this moment of Moses' intercession to God?
So one of our older colleagues, Rabbi William Berman, used to come speak at my school because he had three kids who graduated, so he'd come and address the seniors. And he pointed out that one function of these intercessions is that God says things to get Moses to respond. That it's not that God is going to destroy the people, but he needs Moses to step up for the people. Moses is the one who's also in a precarious situation because he wants to give up.
Yeah.
He wants to abandon the people. And, in some of the stories, he wants to give everything up, his life included. And I think that, perhaps God here is a master psychologist. He gets Moses to defend the people, and then God's response is, Salachti kidvarecha. I'm doing what you want to do, which is forgive the people.
This becomes, I guess, one of the great paradigms of forgiveness. And so in the back of my mind is the golden calf episode. Jeremy, rate them. Which do you think is, or compare, contrast?
Well, so I wanted to say, with a little back turn around to the golden calf episode. After that sin, and we can talk about the parallels between the faithlessness of the people at that point and the faithlessness of the people now. But how does that one end with the Yud Gimel Midot, the 13? This Moshe and God had this very intense encounter on the cleft of the rock, and it's actually very difficult to tell in the Torah who says whether Adonai, Adonai vayikra vayavor Adonai al panav vayikra Adonai al rachum v'chanun. The Lord is gracious and merciful and patient, Rav Chesed ve'emet, abounding in faithfulness and love. It's not clear whether Moshe is speaking or God is speaking or they're singing it together. But now, exactly in the passage that you said, the Midrash wonderfully says about the 13 Midot, listen, whenever you're in trouble, here's what you do. You say these things, I can't resist it. You just access my merciful nature. And that's exactly what Moshe does. Moshe, in this week's Parsha, Moshe is confronted with that crisis and says, Yigdal na koach Adonai kasher dibarta lemor, let your power be great as you have said. Adonai erech hapayim v'rav chesed nosei avon u'afesha v'nakelo yinakeh poker avon avarara. So you, God, told me that you are the paradigm of patience and kindness. So I'm reminding you of that and accessing perhaps the kindness within.
So what do you think is worse, the golden calf or the spies?
Well, in a sense, there are two sides of the same coin, because what's striking about the golden calf is when they pull the golden calf, when it magically appears, they say, this is the God who brought us out of Egypt. So there's the Exodus trope with that we also see in the account of the spies as well, where they're denying God's role in the Exodus. And I think that when we put the stories together, it's really a call for the true worship of God. And it's supposed to pull us back to Sinai, where we're supposed to hear that God brought us out of Egypt. We're supposed to hear that God wants no other images before us. And we're not supposed to hear it for the moment. We're supposed to hear it forever. And we have to keep reminding ourselves of that.
What do you think, Elliot?
You know what? I'm going to say that this episode, the spying episode, is actually a much more difficult episode. Notwithstanding the fact that obviously they violate one of the commandments. They violate, you should not have any other gods beside you, right? And idolatry, yeah, that's big, okay. But it seems that the human element of this is just so much more profound. At the golden calf episode, lots of people were killed in a civil war. Here, the whole people is sentenced basically to wandering, and there's a convulsion here. The people want to kind of break forward. A few people want to break forward, but they have to begin to realize that we're not going to make it, and that it's going to be to our children, and realization, I think, is deeper. It's deeper than idolatry. I don't know.
The awesome, the awesome in the sense of terrifying, and then the no-ra quality of the punishment actually is a really interesting piece of evidence, because in the end of the day, like 3,000 people are killed for the golden calf. That's not that many in the massive camp of Israel, which is 600,000 adult males to 1 million people. It's like a tiny number, percentage-wise. And this, as you point out, is the whole generation. I am going to fall back on almost the educative quality to this, God recognizing that the people aren't ready, rather than maybe their own faithlessness. But I do think that that's a very, the scope of the punishment is really interesting. I also can't, as a Jew who has not made my life in the land of Israel,
Yeah.
I should be so lucky to do so at some point. But I also think that in a sense, idolatry is an imperative. Avoiding idolatry is an imperative, all places and all times. And the identification, as important as Eretz Yisrael is, the reaching the promised land, because it is the promised land, it doesn't occupy the same spot in my religious life as avoiding false idols does.
Interesting. So we're not breaking down here on Zionism and diasporaism, but living in the land obviously is the challenge. How do you create a society that lives in the land? And the generation of the desert is really the generation of formation. And so we can say that Israel, that is modern Israel, is in a constant state of formation. There's so much to really think about and consider when you compare and contrast those stories. But we got to move to the end of the Parsha. And the end of the Parsha contains at least two very interesting things, one of which we're going to probably have to leave to next year, which is the Mokoshesh Eitzim. There's a guy, he's gathering branches on Shabbos.
The local wood gatherer.
What's that?
The local wood gatherer.
The wood gatherer, and that's just not good.
And you know what, you want to have a guy in black clothing walk by him and say, Shabbos!
Not good. Don't.
Well, you can throw stones at him.
You can throw stones at him. Okay, tzitzit. We recite this daily, twice a day, 3 times a day. The Kriyat Shema, Asulam tzitzit. Tell the people that they should wear tzitzit al kanfei v'gdam l'doratam for generations. Talk about this, and talk about this in terms of maybe what is it doing here, and why do we recite this? What does this mean to you?
So I have first of all, I just love this mitzvah. I love the practice of wearing tzitzit. I sometimes think that the major human needs, food, shelter, and clothing, and think about the way that our religion sanctifies food with brachot and kashrut, and we sanctify shelter with mezuzah, and we sanctify and ma'kel gagecha. We sanctify our shelter also by keeping it safe for people, and we sanctify our clothing with this tzitz, this little blossom, this little bud on your clothing, in which you extend out in the form of these strings. And I would say, I'm going to borrow from what Barry said a little bit earlier about the people, by saying, I wish I died in Egypt, they're repudiating the whole gift of God and the whole providential leadership of God. Just let me be a slave. Let me be undignified. I don't care. I don't have to go on a journey. I don't have to aspire. And so when you put on tzitzit, you first of all get reminded of the mitzvot. You have a tendency to forget these things in your smallness and your fear. You got to be reminded of them. You got to do them. But I also want to point out that it's just nanu al tzitzit hakanaf patil techelet. You put on these strings a thread of blue. And most of our listeners probably know that in our own lifetimes, or in roughly the year in our own, in certainly the last 150 years, the Techelet, the original Techelet, has been rediscovered in the form of the Chilazon. Rabbi Yitzchak Halevi Herzog, the great grandfather of the new president of Israel, Nasi Yisrael, Bushi Herzog, discovered through a magnificent work of scholarship and archaeology and chemistry, the ancient dye. And so the ancient dye was, we got to wear royal blue, right? Every single person had one string of royal blue in their clothing. So it's a way of saying, by the way, each one of you are b'nei melachim. Every single one of you, you're not loser slaves. You are royalty, and you have a royal mission. And so wearing tchelet on my tzitzit, on my outer talit, I feel that call to try to aspire to nobility, as exemplified in the thread of royal blue.
Let me piggyback on that, and get Barry will get the last word here. I think what I'd like to say here is that after the messiness of this parsha, after the it's brutal, it's horrible. There's a certain shelter in going back to the idea kadoshim to you, be holy, the whole mitzvot notion, the idea that you are a holy people. In other words, we need these symbols. We need a set of symbols, including clothing, which wraps us, in order to reconnect. And now that we have had a great crisis, a catastrophic crisis, remind ourselves, that there's shelter here, that you can have a moment of contact with the essence and your calling. Barry, what would you say? You're muted there.
I would say that the mitzvah is a humanizing element. Indeed. That we wear the tzitzit because, as all human beings, we can be led astray by our eyes and our heart. And in addition to being royal, we're also human. And even though we will sin, we can be so much better than a sinner. And the tzitzit reminds us of that, I think, that our religious quest is to not follow our eyes and our heart, but to follow God. And we consider ourselves part of royalty because we don't want to be like our ancestors who stayed in the wilderness because they could not seize the moment. We want to be like our ancestors who were able to venture forth into the promised land.
Wow, what a lovely thought to end on. It's maybe that's the idea. The Parsha wants to give us that aspirational idea to really see ourselves as if we are going forward, and that's what we need to do. The reminders, the royalty, all of the symbolism. What's been wonderful
is that I've come to think lately that education is all about change. That if you want to be educated, you need to recognize that you're not the same person that you were yesterday. And existentially, the difficulty for the generation of the wilderness is that they could not change. They were mired in the past, and they could not find within them enough to go beyond the physical step forward. They had no emotional apparatus that could carry them forward. And that is perhaps why God left them in the wilderness, so that the wilderness-born generation could inherit the land.
But what you said just reminds me of a in the Gemara and Sanhedrin, who gets Olam Haba? Who's like the door of the generation of the flood is so bad they don't get the generation of the Tower of Babel is so bad they don't get the Olam Haba. Rabbi Akiva says, the door of the generation of the Midbar is so bad they don't get it. And the Talmud says about that, Rabbi Akiva abandoned his typical kindness. What a great comment.
Okay.
So we, the Talmud, or I forget the name of the person who says it, but somebody says, Rabbi Akiva has here abandoned his typical kindness. And I think that, in our conversation today, we've wrestled with, obviously Torah has very negative judgment of these people, but we've also, as you said, Bar, like if we were there, where would we have been? To be able to look at empathy, to be able to look with empathy at people who are struggling to reach beyond themselves to a very, very grand task, and how scary and how challenging that actually is. Hopefully with we can look in our eyes with a little chesed as well.
Wow, this generation will live in our imaginations, in our consciousness, as it always does, and so will this conversation. This has been really meaningful. I hope that our listeners and viewers have been able to reshape the way they think about this story. I want to thank Barry, Jeremy, for this great conversation. I want to thank our listeners and viewers. We wish you all a beautiful Shabbat, and we'll see you next week on another episode of Parasha Talk. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.